The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 12, Side 1. At Runnymede on the Thames, near Windsor, the forces of the aristocracy encamped opposite the few supporters of the king. There John made his second great surrender and signed in 1215 Magna Carta, the most famous document in English history, excerpted below. John, by the grace of God, King of England, to his archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, barons, and all his faithful subjects, greeting. Know ye that we have by this our present charter confirmed for us and our heirs forever, 1. That the Church of England shall be free, and have her whole rights and liberties inviolable. 2. We grant to all the freemen of our kingdom, for us and for our heirs forever, all the below-written liberties. 12. No scutage or aid shall be imposed, unless by the general council of our kingdom. 14. For holding the general council concerning the assessment of aids and scutage, we shall cause to be summoned the archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, and greater barons of the realm, and all others who hold of us in chief. The 5 groups here named later became the House of Lords. 15. We will not in future grant to any one that he may take aid of his own free, that is, non-slave, tenants, except to ransom his body, and to make his eldest son a knight, and once to marry his eldest daughter, and for this there shall be only a reasonable aid. 17. Common pleas shall not follow our court, but shall be held in some fixed place. 36. Nothing henceforth shall be given or taken for a writ of inquisition, but it shall be granted freely. That is, no man shall be long imprisoned without trial. 39. No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned or diseased, that is, dispossessed, or outlawed or banished or in any way destroyed, unless by the lawful judgment of his peers, that is, his equals in rank, or by the law of the land. 40. We will sell to no man, we will not deny to any man either justice or right. 41. All merchants shall have safe and secure conduct to go out of and to come into England, and to stay there, and to pass as well by land as by water, for buying or selling, without any unjust tolls. 60. All the aforesaid customs and liberties, all people of our kingdom, as well as clergy, as laity, shall observe, as far as they are concerned towards their dependents. Given under our hand in the presence of witnesses in the meadow called Runnymede on the 15th day of June, in the 17th year of our reign. The Great Charter deserves its fame as the foundation of the liberties today enjoyed by the English-speaking world. It was indeed limited. It defined the rights of the nobles and the clergy far more than of the whole people. No arrangements were made to implement the pious gesture of Article 60. The Charter was a victory for feudalism rather than for democracy. But it defined and safeguarded basic rights. It established habeas corpus and trial by jury. It gave to an incipient parliament a power of the purse that would later arm the nation against tyranny. It transformed absolute into limited and constitutional monarchy. John, however, had no idea that he had immortalized himself by surrendering his despotic powers or claims. He signed under duress, and on the morrow he plotted to annul the charter. He appealed to the Pope, and Innocent III, whose policy now required the support of England against France, came to the defense of his humiliated vassal by proclaiming the charter void, and forbidding John to obey or the nobles to enforce its terms. The barons ignored the decree. Innocent excommunicated them and the citizens of London and the 5 ports. But Stephen Langton, who had led in formulating the charter, refused to publish the edict. Papal legates in England suspended Langton, promulgated the decree, raised an army of mercenaries in Flanders and France, and with it ravaged the English nobility with fire and sword, plunder, murder, and rape. Apparently the nobles had no dependable public support. Instead of resisting with their own feudal levies, they invited Louis, son of the French king, to invade England, defend them, and take the English throne as his reward. Had the plan succeeded, England might have become part of France. Papal legates forbade Louis to cross the Channel, and excommunicated him and all his followers when he persisted. Louis, arriving in London, received the homage and fealty of the barons. Everywhere outside of mercantile London, John was victorious and merciless. Then, amid the energy and fury of his triumph, he was struck down by dysentery, made his way painfully to a monastery, died at Newark in the 49th year of his age. A papal legate crowned John's 6-year-old son as Henry III from 1216 to 1272. A regency was formed with the Earl of Pembroke at its head. Encouraged by this elevation of one of their number, the nobles went over to Henry and sent Louis back to France. Henry grew into an artist king, a connoisseur of beauty, the inspiration and financier for the building of Westminster Abbey. He thought the charter a disintegrating force and tried to abrogate it, but failed. He taxed the nobles within an inch of revolution, always swearing that the latest levy would be the last. The popes needed money, too, and with the king's consent drew tithes from English parishes to support the wars of the papacy against Frederick II. The memory of these exactions prepared the revolts of Wycliffe and Henry VIII. Edward I, 1272 to 1307, was less a scholar than his father and more a king. Ambitious, strong of will, tenacious in war, subtle in policy, rich in stratagems and spoils, yet capable of moderation and caution, and of far-seeing purposes that made his reign one of the most successful in English history. He reorganized the army, trained a large force of archers in the use of the longbow, and established a national militia by ordering every able-bodied Englishman to possess and learn the use of arms. Unwittingly, he created a military basis for democracy. So strengthened, he conquered Wales, won and lost Scotland, refused to pay the tribute that John had promised the popes, and abolished the papal suzerainty over England. But the greatest event of his reign was the development of Parliament. Perhaps without willing it, Edward became the central figure in England's finest achievement, the reconciliation in government and character of liberty and law. 4. The growth of the law. It was in this period, from the Norman conquest to Edward II, that the law and government of England took the forms which they maintained till the 19th century. Through the superimposition of Norman feudal upon Anglo-Saxon local law, English law for the first time became national, no longer the law of Essex or Mercia or the Dane law, but the law and custom of the realm. We can hardly realize now what a legal revolution was implied when Ranulph de Glanville, who died in 1190, used this phrase. Under the stimulus of Henry II and the guidance of his justiciar, Glanville, English law and courts acquired such repute for expedition and equity, tempered with corruption, that rival kings in Spain submitted their dispute to the royal court of England. Glanville may have been the author of a treatise on laws, Tractatus de Legibus, traditionally ascribed to him. In any case, it is our oldest textbook of English law. Half a century later, from 1250 to 1256, Henry de Bracton achieved the first systematic digest in his 5-volume classic on the laws and customs of England, De Legibus et Consuetudinibus Angliae. The king's rising need for money and troops forced the expansion of the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot into the English Parliament. Impatient to raise more funds than the lords would vote him, Henry III summoned 2 knights from each county to join the barons and prelates in the Great Council of 1254. When Simon de Montfort, son of a famous Albigensian crusader, led a revolt of the nobles against Henry III in 1264, he tried to win the middle classes to his cause by asking not only 2 knights from each county, but also 2 leading citizens from each borough or town to join the barons in a national assembly. The towns were growing, the merchants had money. It was worthwhile consulting these men if they would pay as well as talk. Edward I profited from Simon's example. Caught in the toils of simultaneous wars with Scotland, Wales, and France, he was constrained to seek the support and funds of all ranks. In 1295 he summoned the Model Parliament, the first complete parliament in English history. What touches all, his writ of summons read, should be approved by all, and common dangers should be met by measures agreed upon in common. So Edward invited 2 burgesses from every city, borough, and leading town to attend the great council at Westminster. These men were chosen by the more substantial citizens in each locality. No one dreamed of universal suffrage in a society where only a minority could read. In the model parliament itself, the commons did not at once hold equal powers with the aristocracy. There was as yet no annual parliament, meeting at its own will as the sole source of law. But by 1295 the principle was accepted that no statute passed by Parliament could be abrogated except by Parliament. And in 1297 it was further agreed that no taxes were to be levied without Parliament's consent. Such were the modest beginnings from which grew the most democratic government in history. The clergy only reluctantly attended this enlarged Parliament. They sat apart and refused to vote supplies except in their provincial assemblies. Ecclesiastical courts continued to try all cases involving canon law, and most cases involving any member of the clergy. Clerics accused of felonies might be tried by secular authorities, but those convicted of crimes short of high treason were, through benefit of clergy, handed over to an ecclesiastical court which alone could punish them. Moreover, most judges in secular tribunals were ecclesiastics, for education in law was largely confined to the clergy. Under Edward I, the secular courts became more secular. When the clergy refused to join in voting supplies, Edward I, arguing that those who were protected by the state should share its burdens, directed his courts to hear no cause in which a churchman was plaintiff, but to try every suit in which a cleric was defendant. In further retaliation, Edward's Council of 1279, by the Statute of Mortmain, forbade the grant of lands to ecclesiastical bodies without the royal consent. Despite this divided jurisdiction, English law developed rapidly under William I, Henry II, John, and Edward I. It was a thoroughly feudal law and bore down heavily on the serf. Crimes of freemen against serfs were usually amerced by fines. The law allowed women to own, inherit, or bequeath property, make contracts, sue and be sued, and gave the wife a dower right of 1/3 in her husband's real property. But all the movable property that she brought to her marriage or acquired during it belonged to her husband. Legally, all land belonged to the king, and was held from him in fief. Normally, the whole estate of a feudal lord was bequeathed to the eldest son, not only to keep the property intact, but to protect the feudal suzerain from a division of vassal responsibility in dues and war. Among the free peasantry, no such rule of primogeniture obtained. In so feudal a code, the law of contract remained immature. An assize of measures of 1197 standardized weights, measures, and coins, and provided state supervision of their use. Enlightened commercial legislation in England began with the Statute of Merchants in 1283 and the Merchants' Charter, or Carta Mercatoria, of 1303, two more achievements of Edward I's creative reign. Legal procedure slowly improved. To enforce the laws, every ward had a watch, every borough a constable, every shire a shire reeve, or sheriff. All men were bound to raise a hue and cry on perceiving a violation of the law, and to join in pursuing the offender. Bail was admitted. It is a major credit to English law that torture was not used in examining suspects or witnesses. When Edward II was induced by Philip IV of France to arrest the English Templars, he could find no evidence by which to convict them. Thereupon Pope Clement V, doubtless constrained by Philip, wrote to Edward, "We hear that you forbid torture as contrary to the laws of your land. But no state law can override canon law, our law. Therefore I command you at once to submit those men to torture." Edward yielded, but torture was not again used in English legal procedure till the reign of Bloody Mary, from 1553 to 1558. The Normans brought to England the old Frank system of inquisitio, or judicial inquiry by a jurata, or sworn group of local citizens, into the fiscal and legal affairs of a district. The Assize of Clarendon, circa 1166, developed this jury plan by permitting litigants to submit the question of their veracity not to trial by combat, but to the country, that is, to a jury of 12 knights chosen from the local citizenry, in the presence of the court by 4 knights named by the sheriff. This was the grand assize, or major sitting. In the petty assize, or minor session for the trial of ordinary cases, the sheriff himself chose 12 freemen from the neighborhood. Men shunned jury service then as now, and had no notion that the system would be one of the foundations of democracy. By the end of the 13th century, verdict by a jury had almost everywhere in England replaced the old tests of barbarian law. 5. The English Scene. England in 1300 was 90% rural, with 100 towns whose modern successors would rank them as villages, and one city, London, boasting of 40,000 population, 4 times more than any other town in England, but far inferior in wealth or beauty to Paris, Bruges, Venice, or Milan, not to speak of Constantinople, Palermo, or Rome. Houses were of wood, 2 or 3 stories high, with gabled roofs. Often the upper story projected beyond the one beneath. City law forbade emptying the end products of kitchen, bedroom, or bath through the windows, but the tenants of upper stories often yielded to the convenience. Most of the slops from the houses found their way into the current of rainwater that ran along the curbs. It was forbidden to cast feces, permissible to empty urinals into this gutter stream. It could to improve sanitation, ordered citizens to clean the streets before their homes, levied fines for negligence, and hired rakers to gather garbage and filth and cart these to dung boats on the Thames. Horses, cattle, pigs, and poultry were kept by many citizens, but this was no great evil, since there were many open spaces, and nearly every house had a garden. Here and there rose a structure of stone, like the Temple Church, Westminster Abbey, or the Tower of London, which William the Conqueror had built to guard his capital and shelter distinguished prisoners. Londoners were already proud of their city. Soon Froissart would say that they are of more weight than all the rest of England, for they are the most mighty in wealth and men. And the monk Thomas of Walsingham would describe them as of all people almost the most proud, arrogant, and greedy, disbelieving in ancient customs, disbelieving in God. Through these centuries, the amalgamation of Norman, Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Celtic stocks, speech, and ways produced the English nation, language, and character. As Normandy fell away from England, the Norman families in Britain forgot Normandy and learned to love their new land. The mystic and poetic qualities of the Celt remained, especially in the lower classes, but were tempered by Norman vigor and earthiness. Amid the strife of nations and classes, and the blows of famine and plague, the resultant Britain could still make what Henry of Huntingdon, possibly from 1084 to 1155, called Anglia plena Iocis, Merry England, a nation of abounding energy, rude jests, boisterous games, good fellowship, a love of dancing, minstrelsy, and ale. From those virile loins and generations would come the hearty sensuality of Chaucer's pilgrims, and the magnificent bombast of the cultured swashbucklers of the Elizabethan age. 9. Ireland, Scotland, Wales, 1066 to 1318. In the year 1154, Henry II became King of England, and an Englishman, Nicholas Breakspear, became Pope Hadrian IV. A year later, Henry sent John of Salisbury to Rome with a subtle message. Ireland was in a state of political chaos, literary decline, moral debasement, religious independence, and decay. Would not the Pope permit Henry to take possession of the individualistic isle and restore it to social order and papal obedience? If we may believe Giraldus Cambrensis, the Pope agreed, and by the bull Laudabiliter granted Ireland to Henry on condition of restoring orderly government there, bringing the Irish clergy into better cooperation with Rome, and arranging that a penny, or 83 cents, should be paid yearly to the See of Peter for every house in Ireland. Henry was too busy at the time to take advantage of this nihil obstat, but he remained in a receptive mood. In 1166, Dermot MacMurrough, King of Leinster, was defeated in war by Tiernan O'Rourke, King of Breffni, whose wife he had seduced. Expelled by his subjects, he fled with his beautiful daughter Eva to England and France, and secured from Henry II a letter assuring royal goodwill to any of his subjects who should help Dermot to regain the Leinster throne. At Bristol, Dermot received from Richard Fitzgilbert, Earl of Pembroke and Wales, known as Strongbow, a pledge of military support in return for Eva's hand in marriage, and a succession to Dermot's kingdom. In 1169, Richard led a small force of Welshmen into Ireland, restored Dermot with the help of the Leinster clergy, and on Dermot's death in 1171, inherited the kingdom. Rory O'Connor, then High King of Ireland, led an army against the Welsh invaders and bottled them up in Dublin. The besieged made an heroic sortie, and the ill-trained and poorly equipped Irish fled. Summoned by Henry II, Strongbow crossed to Wales, met the king, and agreed to surrender to him Dublin and other Irish ports, and to hold the rest of Leinster in fief from the English crown. Henry landed near Waterford in 1171 with 4,000 men, won the support of the Irish clergy, and received the allegiance of all Ireland except Connaught and Ulster. The Welsh conquest was turned into a Norman-English conquest without a battle. A synod of Irish prelates declared their full submission to the Pope, and decreed that thereafter the ritual of the Irish Church should conform to that of England and Rome. Most of the Irish kings were allowed to keep their thrones on condition of feudal fealty and annual tribute to the King of England. Henry had accomplished his purpose with economy and skill, but he erred in thinking that the forces which he left behind him could sustain order and peace. His appointees fought one another for the spoils, and their aides and troops plundered the country with a minimum of restraint. The conquerors did their best to reduce the Irish to serfdom. The Irish resisted with guerrilla warfare, and the result was a century of turmoil and destruction. In 1315, some Irish chieftains offered Ireland to Scotland, where Robert Bruce had just defeated the English at Bannockburn. Robert's brother Edward landed in Ireland with 6,000 men. Pope John XII pronounced excommunication upon all who should aid the Scots. But nearly all Irishmen rose at Edward's call, and in 1316 they crowned him king. 2 years later he was defeated and slain near Dundalk, and the revolt collapsed in poverty and despair. "The Scots," said Ranulph Higden, a 14th-century Briton, "be light of heart, strong and wild enough, but by mixing with Englishmen they be much amended. They be cruel upon their enemies, and hate bondage most of anything, and hold it foul sloth if any man dieth in bed, and great worship if he die in the field." Ireland remained Irish but lost its liberty. Scotland became British but remained free. Angles, Saxons, and Normans multiplied in the lowlands and reorganized agricultural life on a feudal plan. Malcolm III, from 1058 to 1093, was a warrior who repeatedly invaded England. But his Queen Margaret was an Anglo-Saxon princess who converted the Scottish court to the English language, brought in English-speaking clergy, and reared her sons in English ways. The last and strongest of them, David I, from 1124 to 1153, made the Church his chosen instrument of rule, founded English-speaking monasteries at Kelso, Dryburgh, Melrose, and Holyrood, levied tithes, for the first time in Scotland, for the support of the Church, and gave so lavishly to bishops and abbots that people mistook him for a saint. Under David I, Scotland, in all but its highlands, became an English state. But it was not the less independent. The English immigrants were transformed into patriotic Scots. From their number came the Stuarts and the Bruces. David I invaded and captured Northumberland. Malcolm IV, from 1153 to 1165, lost it. William the Lion, from 1165 to 1214, trying to regain it, was taken prisoner by Henry II, and was freed only on pledging homage to the King of England for the Scottish crown, this in 1174. 15 years later, he bought release from this pledge by helping to finance Richard I in the Third Crusade. But the English kings continued to claim feudal suzerainty over Scotland. Alexander III, from 1249 to 1286, recovered the Hebrides from Norway, maintained friendly relations with England, and gave Scotland a golden age of prosperity and peace. At Alexander's death, Robert Bruce and John Balliol, descendants of David I, contested the succession. Edward I of England seized the opportunity. By his support, Balliol was made king, but acknowledged the overlordship of England, this in 1292. When, however, Edward ordered Balliol to raise troops to fight for England in France, the Scotch nobles and bishops rebelled, and bade Balliol make alliance with France against England in 1295. Edward defeated the Scots at Dunbar in 1296, received the submission of the aristocracy, dethroned Balliol, appointed 3 Englishmen to rule Scotland for him, and returned to England. Many Scotch nobles owned land in England and were thereby mortgaged to obedience. But the older Gaelic Scots strongly resented the surrender. One of them, Sir William Wallace, organized an army of the Commons of Scotland, routed the English garrison, and for a year ruled Scotland as regent for Balliol. Edward returned and defeated Wallace at Falkirk in 1298. In 1305 he captured Wallace and had him disembowelled and quartered, according to the English law of treason. A year later another defender was forced into the field. Robert Bruce, grandson of the Bruce who had claimed the throne in 1286, quarreled with John Cummin, a leading representative of Edward I in Scotland, and killed him. Thereby committed to rebellion, Bruce had himself crowned king, though only a small group of nobles supported him, and the Pope excommunicated him for his crime. Edward once more marched north, but died on the way in 1307. Edward II's incompetence was a blessing for Bruce. The nobles and clergy of Scotland rallied to the outlaw's banner. His reinforced armies, bravely led by his brother Edward and Sir James Douglas, captured Edinburgh, invaded Northumberland, and seized Durham. In 1314, Edward II led into Scotland the largest army that the land had ever seen, and met the Scots at Bannockburn. Bruce had had his men dig and conceal pits before his position. Many of the English, charging, fell into the morass, and the English army was almost totally destroyed. In 1328, the regents for Edward III, involved in war with France, signed the Treaty of Northampton, making Scotland once more free. Meanwhile, a like struggle had come to other issue in Wales. William I claimed suzerainty over it as part of the realm of the defeated Harold. He had no time to add it to his conquests, but he set up 3 earldoms on its eastern frontier and encouraged their lords to expand them into Wales. South Wales was meanwhile overrun by Norman buccaneers who left the prefix Fitz, from fils or son, on some Welsh names. In 1094, Cadogan ap Bleddyn subdued these Normans. In 1165 the Welsh defeated the English at Corwin, and Henry II, busy with Becket, acknowledged the independence of South Wales under its enlightened king, Rhys ap Griffith. This in 1171. Llewellyn the Great, by his ability in both war and statesmanship, extended his rule over nearly all the country. His sons quarreled and disordered the land, but his grandson, Llewellyn ap Griffith, who died in 1282, restored unity, made peace with Henry III, and created for himself the title of Prince of Wales. Edward I, intent on uniting Wales and Scotland with England, invaded Wales with an immense army and fleet in 1282. Llewellyn died in a chance encounter with a small border force. His brother David was captured by Edward, and his severed head, with Llewellyn's, was suspended from the Tower of London and left to bleach in the sun, wind, and rain. Wales was made a part of England in 1284, and Edward in 1301 gave the title of Prince of Wales to the heir to the English throne. Through these exaltations and depressions the Welsh kept their own language and their old customs, tilled their rough soil with obstinate courage, and solaced their days and nights with legend, poetry, music, and song. Their bards now gave form to the tales of the Mabinogion, enriching literature with a mystic melodious tenderness uniquely Welsh. Annually the bards and minstrels assembled in a national Eisteddfod, from Eisteddf to sit, which can be traced back to 1176. Contests were held in oratory, poetry, singing, and the playing of musical instruments. The Welsh could fight bravely, but not long. They were soon eager to return and protect at first hand their women, children, and homes. And one of their proverbs wished that every ray of the sun were a poniard to pierce the friends of war. 10. The Rhinelands, 1066 to 1315. The countries huddled about the lower Rhine and its many mouths were among the richest in the medieval world. South of the Rhine lay the county of Flanders, running from Calais through modern Belgium to the Scheldt. Formerly it was a fief held from the French king. Actually, it was ruled by a dynasty of enlightened counts, checked only by the proud autonomy of the towns. Near the Rhine the people were Flemish, of Low German origin, and spoke a German dialect. West of the Lys River they were Walloons, a mixture of Germans and French on a Celtic base, and spoke a dialect of French. Commerce and industry fattened and disturbed Ghent, Oudenarde, Courtrai, Ypres, and Kassel in the Flemish northeast, and Bruges, Lille, and Douai in the Walloon southwest. In these cities population was denser than anywhere else in Europe north of the Alps. In 1300 the cities dominated the counts. The magistrates of the larger communities formed a supreme court for the county and negotiated on their own authority with foreign cities and governments. Usually the counts cooperated with the cities, encouraged manufactures and trade, maintained a stable currency, and as early as 1100, 2 centuries before England, established uniform measures and weights for all the towns. The class war ultimately destroyed the freedom of both the cities and the counts. As the proletariat rose in number, resentment, and power, and the counts sided with them as an offset to the bumptious bourgeoisie, the merchants sought support from Philip Augustus of France, who promised it in the hope of bringing Flanders effectively under the French crown. England, anxious to keep the chief market for her wool out of the control of the French king, allied herself with the Counts of Flanders and Hainaut, the Duke of Brabant, and Otto IV of Germany. Philip defeated this coalition at Bouvines in 1214, subdued the counts, and protected the merchants in their oligarchic regime. The conflict of powers and classes continued. In 1297, Count Guy de Dampierre again allied Flanders with England. Philip the Fair invaded Flanders, imprisoned Guy, and forced him to cede the country to France. But when the French army moved to occupy Bruges, the commons rose, overcame the troops, massacred rich merchants, and gained possession of the town. Philip sent a large army to avenge this affront. The workers of the towns formed themselves into an impromptu army and defeated the knights and mercenaries of France in the Battle of Courtrai, this in 1302. The aged Guy de Dampierre was released and restored, and the strange alliance of feudal counts and revolutionary proletaires enjoyed a decade of victory. What we now know as Holland was, from the 3rd to the 9th century, part of the Frank kingdom. In 843 it became the northernmost portion of the buffer state of Lorraine created by the Treaty of Verdun. In the 9th and 10th centuries it was divided into feudal fiefs for better resistance to Norse raids. The Germans who cleared and settled the heavily wooded district north of the Rhine called it Holtland, that is, woodland. Most of the people were serfs, absorbed in the struggle to wrest a living from a land that had always to be diked or drained. Half of Holland exists by the taming of the sea. But there were cities, too, not quite as rich and turbulent as the Flemish towns, but soundly based on steady industry and orderly trade. Dordrecht was the most prosperous. Utrecht was a center of learning. Haarlem was the seat of the Count of Holland. Delft became the capital for a time. Then, toward 1250, The Hague. Amsterdam made its debut in 1204, when a feudal lord built a fortress chateau at the mouth of the Amstel River. The sheltered site on the Zuider Zee and the pervasive canals invited commerce. In 1297 the city was made a free port, where goods could be received and reshipped free of customs duties, and thenceforth Little Holland played a large part in the economic world. There, as elsewhere, commerce nourished culture. In the 13th century we find a Dutch poet, Merlant, satirized the luxurious life of the clergy, and in the monasteries Dutch art in sculpture, pottery, painting, and illumination was beginning its unique and extraordinary career. South of Holland lay the Duchy of Brabant, which then contained the cities of Antwerp, Brussels, and Louvain. Liège was ruled independently by its bishops, who allowed it a large measure of autonomy. Still farther south were the counties of Hainaut, Namur, Limburg, and Luxembourg. The Duchy of Lorraine, with the cities of Trier, Nancy, and Metz, and several other principalities, nominally subject to the German emperor, but left for the most part to their ruling counts. Each of these districts had a vibrant history of politics, love, and war. We salute them and move on. South and west of them lay Burgundy, in what is now east-central France. Its varying boundaries discouraged definition. Its political fortunes would fill vain tomes. In 888, Rudolf I made it an independent kingdom. In 1032, Rudolf III bequeathed it to Germany, but in that year part of it was united as a duchy to France. The Dukes of Burgundy, like its early kings, governed with intelligence and for the most part cherished peace. Their great age would come in the 15th century. In classical times, Switzerland was the home of diverse tribes, Helvetii, Rheti, Lepontii, of mixed Celtic, Teutonic, and Italic origin. In the 3rd century, the Alemanni occupied and Germanized the northern plateau. After the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the land was divided into feudal fiefs, subject to the Holy Roman Empire. But it is difficult to enslave mountaineers, and the Swiss, while acknowledging some feudal dues, soon liberated themselves from serfdom. The villages in democratic assemblies chose their own officials and ruled themselves by the ancient Germanic laws of the Alemanni and Burgundians. For mutual protection, the peasants neighboring Lake Lucerne formed themselves into forest cantons, or Waldstädte, Uri, Nidwalden, and Schwyz, which later gave its name to the state. The sturdy burghers of the towns that had grown along the Alpine passes, Geneva, Constance, Fribourg, Bern, and Basel, elected their own officials and administered their own laws. Their feudal overlords raised no objection to this so long as basic feudal taxes were paid. The Habsburg counts, who from 1173 held the northern districts, proved an exception to this rule and earned the hatred of the men of Schwyz by attempting to apply feudal dues in full severity. In 1291 the 3 forest cantons formed an everlasting league and swore a confederatio to give one another aid against external aggression or internal disturbance, to arbitrate all differences, and to recognize no judge who was not a native of the valley or had bought his office. Lucerne, Zurich, and Constance soon joined the league. In 1315 the Habsburg dukes sent 2 armies into Switzerland to enforce all feudal dues. In the pass of Morgarten, the infantry of Schwyz and Uri, armed with halberds, defeated the Austrian cavalry in the Marathon of Switzerland. The Austrian forces withdrew. The 3 cantons renewed their oath of mutual support on December 9, 1315, and created the Swiss Confederacy. It was not yet an independent state. The free citizens acknowledged certain feudal obligations and the suzerainty of the Holy Roman Emperor, but feudal lords and holy emperors had learned to respect the arms and liberties of the Swiss cantons and towns, and the victory of Morgarten had opened the way to the most stable and sensible democracy in history. 11. France, 1060 to 1328. 1. Philip Augustus. At the accession of Philip II Augustus in 1180, France was a minor and harassed state, hardly promising any grandeur to come. England held Normandy, Brittany, Anjou, Touraine, and Aquitaine, a domain thrice the size of that directly controlled by the French king. Most of Burgundy adhered to Germany, and the flourishing county of Flanders was in effect an independent principality. So were the counties of Lyon, Savoie, and Chambéry. So was Provence, southeastern France, rich in wine, oil, fruit, poets, and the cities of Arles and Avignon, Aix and Marseille. The Dauphiné, centering about Vienne, had been bequeathed to Germany as part of Burgundy. It was now independently ruled by a dauphin, who took his title from the dolphin that was an emblem of his family. France proper was divided into duchies, counties, seigneuries, seneschalties, and bailliages, or bailiwicks, governed, in order of increasing dependence upon the king, by dukes, counts, seigneurs, seneschals, or royal stewards, and bailiffs. This loose aggregation, already called Francia in the 9th century, was in diverse degrees and with many limitations subject to the French king. Paris, his capital, was in 1180 a city of wooden buildings and muddy streets. Its Roman name, Lutetia, had meant the town of mud. Philip Augustus, shocked by the smell of the thoroughfares that ran beside the Seine, ordered that all the streets of Paris should be paved with solid stone. He was the first of three powerful rulers who in this age raised France to the intellectual, moral, and political leadership of Europe. But there had been strong men before him. Philip I, from 1060 to 1108, made a secure niche for himself in history by divorcing his wife at 40 and persuading Count Fulk of Anjou to cede to him the Countess Bertrade. A priest was found to solemnize the adultery as marriage, but Pope Urban II, coming to France to preach the First Crusade, excommunicated the king. Philip persisted in sin for 12 years. At last he sent Bertrade away and was shriven. But a while later he repented his repentance and resumed his queen. She traveled with him to Anjou, taught her two husbands amity, and seems to have served both of them to the best of her charms. Having grown fat at 45, Philip handed over the major affairs of state to his son Louis VI, from 1108 to 1137, himself known as Louis the Fat. He deserved a better name. For 24 years he fought, finally with success, the robber barons who plundered travelers on the roads. He strengthened the monarchy by organizing a competent army. He did what he could to protect the peasants, the artisans, and the communes, and he had the good sense to make the Abbot Suger his chief minister and friend. Suger of Saint-Denis, from 1081 to 1151, was the Richelieu of the 12th century. He managed the affairs of France with wisdom, justice, and farsight. He encouraged and improved agriculture. He designed and built one of the earliest and finest masterpieces of the Gothic style, and he wrote an illuminating account of his ministry and work. He was the most valuable bequest left by Louis the Fat to his son, whom Suger served till death. Louis VII, from 1137 to 1180, was the man of whom Eleanor of Aquitaine said that she had married a king only to find him a monk. He labored conscientiously at his royal tasks, but his virtues ruined him. His devotion to government appeared to Eleanor as marital neglect. His patience with her amours added insult to negligence. She divorced him and gave her hand and her duchy of Aquitaine to Henry II of England. Disillusioned with life, Louis turned to piety and left to his son the task of building a strong France. Philip II Augustus, like a later Philippe, was a bourgeois gentilhomme on the throne, a master of practical intelligence softened with sentiment, a patron of learning with no taste for it, a man of shrewd caution and prudent courage, of quick temper and ready amnesty, of unscrupulous but controlled acquisitiveness, of a moderated piety that could be generous to the Church without allowing religion to countermand his politics, and of a patient perseverance that won what bold adventurousness might never have attained. Such a man, at once prosaic and auguste, this title, applied to him by his chaplain, found no medieval currency, but was applied to him by modern French historians, amiably inflexible and ruthlessly wise, was what his country needed at a time when, between Henry II's England and Barbarossa's Germany, France might have ceased to be. His marriages disturbed Europe. His first wife, Isabella, died in 1189, and 4 years later he married Ingeborg, a princess of Denmark. These marriages were political and brought more property than romance. Ingeborg was not to Philip's taste. He ignored her after a day, and within the year he persuaded a council of French bishops to grant him a divorce. Pope Celestine III refused to confirm the decree. In 1196, defying the Pope, he married Agnes of Meran. Celestine excommunicated him, but Philip remained obstinate. "I had rather lose half my domains," he said in a moment of tenderness, "than separate from Agnes." Innocent III commanded him to take back Ingeborg. When Philip refused, the invincible Pope interdicted religious services in Philip's domain. Philip, in a rage, deposed all bishops who obeyed the interdict. Happy Saladin, he mourned, who had no pope above him. And he threatened to turn Mohammedan. After 4 years of this spiritual war, the people began to grumble with fear of hell. Philip dismissed his beloved Agnes in 1202, but kept Ingeborg confined at Étampes till 1213, when he recalled her to his bed. Amid these joys and tribulations, Philip reconquered Normandy from England in 1204, and in the next 2 years annexed Brittany, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Poitou to his directly ruled terrain. He was now strong enough to dominate all the dukes, counts, and seigneurs of his realm. His baillis and seneschals supervised local government. His kingdom had become an international power, not a strip of land along the Seine. John of England, so shorn, was not resigned. He persuaded Otto IV of Germany and the Counts of Boulogne and Flanders to join him against this swelling France. John would attack through Aquitaine, still England's, the others from the northeast. Instead of dividing his forces to meet these separate assaults, Philip led his main army against John's allies and defeated them at Bouvines near Lille in 1214. That battle decided many issues. It deposed Otto, secured the German throne to Frederick II, ended German hegemony, and hastened the decline of the Holy Roman Empire. It reduced the Counts of Flanders to French obedience, added Amiens, Douai, Lille, and Saint-Quentin to the French crown, and in effect extended northeastern France to the Rhine. It left John helpless against his barons and forced him to sign Magna Carta. It weakened monarchy and strengthened feudalism in England and Germany, while it strengthened monarchy and weakened feudalism in France. And it favored the growth of the French communes and middle classes, which had vigorously supported Philip in peace and war. Having trebled the royal domain, Philip governed it with devotion and skill. Half the time at odds with the Church, he replaced ecclesiastics in council and administration with men from the rising lawyer class. He gave charters of autonomy to many cities, encouraged trade by privileges to merchants, alternately protected and plundered the Jews, and fattened his exchequer by commuting feudal services into money payments. The royal revenue was doubled from 600 to 1,200 livres, or $240,000 a day. In his reign, the façade of Notre Dame was completed, and the Louvre was built as a fortress to guard the Seine. When Philip died in 1223, the France of today had been born. 2. St. Louis. His son, Louis VIII, from 1223 to 1226, ruled too briefly to accomplish much. History remembers him chiefly for having married the admirable Blanche of Castile, and begetting by her the one man in medieval history who, like Ashoka in ancient India, succeeded in being at once and in fact a saint and a king. Louis IX was 12, his mother was 38 when Louis VIII died. Daughter of Alfonso IX of Castile, granddaughter of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche lived up to her royal blood. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.